I want to talk about needle depth and how to go about hacking it. One thing's for sure is when I first started, I thought that more pressure equals to better, solid, more consistent saturated lines. I was in for a rude awakening because that's completely wrong. Hacking our needle depth isn't about more pressure, it's not about going deeper, it's not about any of that. It's about aligning our hand speed to our voltage and allowing the needle enough time to make the rounds that it needs to deposit the ink in a clean, solid, consistent, saturated manner. We can have perfect angle, perfect technique. However, if we're not giving our needle enough time to work, we're not going to yield any sort of clean, solid, consistent, saturated results. You'll hear me talk about this a lot within my Fundamental Tattoo Handbook, which is now available on Amazon. You'll hear me talk about giving the needle enough time to make its rounds to deposit the ink cleanly. It's really not a matter of talent, it's a matter of just knowing how your gear works and what your needle is doing. Right here I have the MusoToku Mercury M1 tattoo machine, which is my favorite tattoo machine. I'm going to be running at 6 volts for this demonstration. I'm using a Mass Pro. This is going to be a 7 hollow round liner to get my points across. I know for a fact some of you watching are in these exact phases where you're either pressing too hard or not going deep enough. Let's end that here in this video. 6 volts, my depth is going to be hanging around that much. I like for my needle to hang out so that way I don't have to ride the tube. I personally avoid riding the tube at all costs. It's just not a method that I would ever want to learn or encourage anyone to learn. Running at 6 volts, we can even take this down to 5. Let's take it down to 5 for demonstration purposes. You know what? Let's go to 4. Okay, this is a really low voltage. This is typically what we won't line at. This is a 4.2 stroke, so it is a bit harder. However, still a really low voltage. Why I have a low voltage is to prove that we could line with any voltage and get clean lines if we're giving our needle enough time to make the rounds that it needs to make. So here we are running at 4 volts. I'm going to show you that we are able to get clean, solid, consistent, saturated results without applying immense amount of pressure. You can see that I'm just grazing the skin. I introduce the needle, and now I'm letting the needle make enough rounds at 4 volts to deposit the ink cleanly. I'm angling my needle correctly so that way all 7 needles hit at one time and I get a clean, consistent line weight. And that right there is how I hack my needle depth. I simply adjust my hand speed to my voltage, and I give my needle enough time to make the round that it needs to make to deposit the ink in a clean, solid, consistent, saturated manner. This rule of thumb would apply to any voltage. This right here is proof that it's not a matter of how hard we press into the skin or how light we are. It's a matter of knowing where our needle's hitting and giving it enough time to deposit the ink into the correct layer. Now, that is something that we do develop over time. However, using these basic fundamentals that I'm sharing with you can help you develop in that direction. Still running at 4 volts. I'm going to prioritize my posture, my positioning, my A point. I'm going to taper in slightly to get a smooth introduction there. And you can see that I'm moving really slow to match the voltage of my machine. My needle is only making so many rounds per second. So if I'm moving too quickly, I'm not going to get clean, solid, saturated results. If I'm moving too slow, I'm going to risk blowing out and or causing scarring, textured healing. You get the idea. We don't want that. Let me go ahead and wipe away. Let me get a generous amount of ointment so I can show you that these lines are there to stay, and they are in fact coming out nice, clean, solid, consistent, and saturated. There is no fluctuation, and that is because I am focusing on letting my needle make enough rounds. It has nothing to do with how hard we are pressing into the skin. That's kind of what I wanted to show you here in this video. I wanted to kind of show you by demonstration that needle depth has nothing to do with how hard we're pressing, and more so about hitting the first superficial layers and allowing the needle to push and inject the ink into the skin as opposed to dropping it in like so. So the old method where we're beginning is to drive the needle into the skin like so. That's what we don't want to do. What you want to do is introduce it. And then when you introduce it, keep it at that depth and then leave it there and then taper it out. So here we go. This is the introduction. You can see it's a small taper in like that. If you blink, you'll miss the taper. And you can see that all 7 needles are hitting at once. And we're moving to the tune of 4 volts. This is the tempo because I chose to run at a lower voltage. And taper out like so. Let me wipe away. And you get the idea. This is without me driving it into the skin. How you can tell if I were driving it into the skin, because it would look something like this. It just looks completely different from the other techniques that I was using. You can kind of see though that this line is tremendously thicker than the other surrounding areas, even though all these lines were done with the same line weight. That's what we also want to avoid. If we're pressing down too hard, there's no way that we're going to press down at the same depth on every single line. So therefore, every single line that we do is going to come out inconsistent in size and in line weight, which makes the tattoo read funky and wonky. So when it comes to hacking your needle depth, don't be focused on how hard you're pressing into the skin. I wouldn't focus on that. Focus on hitting the right depth. So practice grazing the skin like so. And then once you're grazing the skin, you're in a better position to see how deep you need to go for the ink to actually be deposited. And I go right here. I'm going to show you a little graze on the skin. So start off like this to practice your needle depth. Start off with just grazing the skin. Even if all the needles aren't hitting together, that's okay. The idea is to get comfortable with just grazing and having the needle float above the skin. That's all we're trying to do with this exercise. So do this about 20 times, and then you're going to start feeling much more natural about grazing the skin. And this is the same approach that we're going to want. We're going to want to keep this sort of light hand when we're trying to work on needle depth as opposed to driving it in there. Now that I'm grazing the skin and I feel comfortable with this grazing motion, I get to slow my hand down now. So I'm going to graze, slow my hand down, and you can see though that the line is actually coming out solid and consistent and saturated, and it's reflecting the line weight that I'm using. All by just simply slowing down and letting the needle deposit the ink. This is the secret right here. This is how we adjust our needle depth. It's not about pressure, it's about knowing when the ink is being deposited and injected into the skin and knowing how to stay there. So we taper in, get to the layer, and taper out. As you can see, it's just the very tip of my needle. And all we do is just give it enough time to make it to rounds. And then the ink is essentially injected into the correct depth of the skin. One thing's for sure is that needle depth is not about talent. It is more about understanding how your gear is working and being comfortable applying it with the gear that you are using. It is not about talent. It is not about how hard you press or anything like that. It's more about giving the needle enough time to do what it needs to do for you. One more time before we close out this video. So just graze the skin. We're not going for saturation. We're getting comfortable with just staying at that superficial layer like that. And then once you get comfortable with grazing the skin like this, you can begin to introduce more time to the area, like so. Still keeping that graze approach. And you can kind of see that when we slow it down and the needle starts working the area a little bit more, how the ink actually gets pushed into the correct depth, as opposed to us going right to it by specific thought and assumption. So you can see, we graze, and if we slow it down, we get saturation. So it's not about depth, it's really not. If we can get saturation by grazing the skin, that right there confirms it's not about needle depth. It's more about giving the needle enough time to do what it needs to do. And that'll be it for this one. That is all that I have for you today. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to drop a comment down below. I'll do my absolute best to assist you in the best possible direction. If you found this video helpful, consider giving this video a thumbs up and subscribing to my channel, as I will be bringing more videos like this for you. With that being said, I appreciate you, your time, and your support. I hope this video can help you. I hope you can apply it on your end. Thank you very much for watching. Have a great day.